There are a lot of questions surrounding Pokemon Pocket. When is the soft launch in New Zealand? What is the energy zone and how does that play out? Nevertheless, even though we don't have all the information available to us, I think we've seen enough cards to actually start to get an idea of what the meta is going to look like. So even though we don't have everything, I do think it's worth taking a little bit of a deep dive into everything that's been revealed thus far so that we can start making some early assumptions on how exactly the game and the meta is going to break away. Mind you, this comes with the caveat, we don't have all the information yet, so while a lot of it is just speculative, I like getting ahead of things. From what we know so far, energy is not a component of your deck. There is an energy zone that presumably is where you pull your energy from, probably going to be a once per turn you're able to do this type of thing, which will make energy acceleration super important. Additionally, your deck is only 20 cards, and instead of 6 prize cards, you have 3 victory tokens effectively. We do still have some EX Pokemon that give out 2 instead of 1, but it's just something to keep in mind. Finally, card weaknesses have been changed. There's no more resistances, and if you are weak to another type, you now take 20 additional damage as opposed to 2x, which is very common design in the regular TCG. Outside of that though, it does seem like it's going to play very similar to what we know the Pokemon TCG to be. So with that, there's a couple of things that we can pull away from how we analyze the Pokemon TCG into what will be good for Pokemon Pocket. Generally, it's understanding a few core components. One, what is the general HP of most cards that I'm going to be playing against? What is the efficiency of the attacks I'm going to expect, especially depending on how good the energy acceleration is in the game? That will dictate what kind of curve I'm looking out to in terms of getting the max efficiency out of my deck. And then finally, what is the utility available to me? If I'm playing a slower strategy, does my reward on that top end make up for what my opponent's trying to do? And how can I mitigate them trying to play out their game plan? So in this analysis, I've decided to break it down into 4 main components. First category is HP. Pretty important to know how many hits I can take before I take a KO. Second, of course, are the attacks. How am I going to be KOing other Pokemon, and at what speed am I going to be able to dish out damage? Third, there's energy acceleration. How quickly can I accelerate the energy on my board to be able to deploy multiple attacks or deploy different strategies? And then finally is the utility. How can I manage what my opponent is doing and try to get an edge over their plays? And then after that, we can actually evaluate a few deck lists. Nothing fully fleshed out because we don't fully know the rules of how many X copies of cards are we allowed to put into our deck, but we do have the semblance of a few strategies, and I figured it's worth putting those into context in terms of the different decks that people are going to play. Also, big shout outs to Pokemon Zone for putting together the cards that we've seen so far. I'm sure the cards are accessible elsewhere, but this is just kind of where we landed on here. So when we're looking at base HP first, something to take of note of is that a lot of stage 1 Pokemon are hovering around the 60 range. Some go to 50, some go to 70, but the average is typically going to stick around the 60 range. So that's something to keep in mind when we think about attacks and what 1 and 2 energy attacks can actually take advantage of that and potentially press some KOs. Of course, the first thing that we're going to be looking at is the base HP stats. So while most Pokemon are chilling at about 60, there are some outliers in that. So when we're looking at Hitmonchan, 80 HP, same thing with Hitmonlee, 80 HP, 90 for Lickitung, 100 for Kangaskhan, which is like really beefy, and then of course Chansey topping off at 120. When looking at non-EX stage 1 Pokemon, this is essentially where it caps off at. While that's not where everyone's going to lean their strategies, it is important to know that if someone is playing just a good stuff pile of just some good 1 knockout Pokemon, this is kind of the numbers they're going to be playing at, especially with Kangaskhan, who has a very relevant 1 energy attack that we're going to talk about in a minute. So this is kind of where our headspace is at. Everything's kind of hovering around 60, with some of the higher end stuff that don't have an evolution chilling at about 80 to 120 in Chansey's case. Thankfully though, Chansey only deals 60 damage, so will just be a damage sponge for the most part unless normal energy gets some acceleration. When we start looking at the EX side of things, that's when we start to get on the 120 and up. So we have Pikachu chilling at 120, then we've got the legendary birds with Zapdos at 130, we've got Articuno at 140, Moltres also at 140, and then we've got Mewtwo EX at 150. Now of course these are 2 prizers, but that high HP threshold does mean that, you know, while they'll take 2 prizes on knockout, you're still in a position where you probably knocked out 2 of your opponent's Pokemon and potentially 3 with their attacks. So in deck building, we need to take account for dealing with these EX Pokemons and their big health totals. And then when we look over at the highest HP we know so far, it's 180. Odds are, I don't think we're at a point in the game where you're going to be OHKOing a 180 HP Pokemon, but it's possible. Charizard himself does have a 200 damage attack, does get rid of the 2 fire energy on the Pokemon, but fire actually has some acceleration there. there. So we do know that at the base level, we don't know what like Blastoise or Venusaur are going to look like, and we know that we're probably going to get EX variants of those as well. But it is good to know that that is kind of the progression where we're looking for damage-wise. HP-wise, if you're trying to deal with the EX Pokemons, it's kind of starting at 120 and breaking upwards, and we need to understand what the damage thresholds are for that, which is very important when we consider things like Charizard. If you're able to get the Charizard, which will take you a few turns, presuming there's no accelerations like Rare Candy or anything like that, then you know that you're in a position where you can knock out multiple Pokemon over turn, and if you have an uncontested Charizard, odds are you're going to be in a really good position. Kind of the same reason that Mewtwo EX is likely to be very powerful early on. Not only does it deal 50 damage for 2, which is kind of in the ballpark of it, there are some attacks that deal more for 2, but they're either conditional on some coin flips or some deck building constraints, kind of like how Pikachu deals more damage based on the stuff you have on bench, but then does have Side Drive, which can deal 150. The difference being also that he's a stage 1 basic Pokemon. Depending on how quickly we can accelerate our energy, maybe it doesn't matter, because by the time you get the 4 energy on your Mewtwo, you would have evolved into the Charizard by that time anyways, and have already gotten to the 4 that you need to have 200 to be able to OHKO, and then in that position, Mewtwo's 150 can't actually out to the Charizard the turn that it comes out. And then because you likely already took something else out with your Charizard, regardless if it's an EX or not, you only need to take out another EX to be able to go and win those 3. Of course, these are meant to be very quick matches. So with the life totals chilling in that kind of generic space where just regular Pokemon are chilling anywhere between on average 60, and then for the higher end ones between 80 and 120, with the EXs being anywhere from 120 to 180. Obviously Charizard being a little bit more work because you actually have to evolve into him. We have to get an idea of like what damage is looking like. Primarily, what's the most efficient cheap damage that we can get into, and then what are the bigger damage thresholds to keep in mind, like we just saw with Charizard and Mewtwo. So to kick it off, Kangaskhan is like potentially pretty high rolly. For 1 energy Dizzy Punch, you flip 2 coins, and on every head you're going to deal 30. So on average, you're usually going to deal 30 damage. On a low roll, you're going to deal nothing, and on a high roll, you actually deal 60. So in this case, you just need to be very considerate that if you're putting a 60 HP Pokemon up front, that a Dizzy Punch could very likely take them out. Which is why it's not a terrible idea to have a bit beefier Pokemon to put on your front line to be able to kind of sit there for a couple of turns. Looking over to Electabuzz, has Thunder Punch. For 2 Thunder energy, you get to flip a coin. If heads, this attack does 40 additional, otherwise it deals 20 to itself. So for 2 energy, we're dealing 80 on a basic Pokemon, which means if it gets knocked out, we're only giving away 1 prize token. Now we're getting into really important thresholds. If your opponent decides to, I don't know that this is going to be a deck, but if your opponent decides to do Hitmonlee, Hitmonchan, just like beats. So let's say your turn 1 player, you play out your Electabuzz, you attach 1 energy to him, your turn comes back, now you just slide the other energy, and now you're pretty much guaranteed to be able to start dishing out at minimum 40 damage, and on a good high roll 80. This is something I want us to keep in mind as we see more and more cards. There are a lot of coin flips when it comes to the attacks here. Even like some of the best Pokemon in here have coin flips, and if they don't have coin flips, their attacks will make you burn away some energy, which is why like energy acceleration is even more important on that front, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but it is something to keep in mind. There's a lot of cards we haven't seen yet, but thus far it does seem like that's the trend, that we're either going to be dealing with coin flips or with burning off a lot of energy. When it comes to Vaporeon, I actually decided to include it because 60 damage isn't phenomenal, but it is enough to get most Pokemon outside of the highest HP base EXs to have health. And that coincides really well with the 30 healing that Bubble Drain actually gets. So it's a bit of an expensive attack, but if we're sitting here realizing that most of the format is actually on average doing between 50 to about 90 damage, we can consider the fact that healing 30 means that Vaporeon's in a pretty good position to actually be able to survive over a couple of turns. How good that healing is going to be is really going to depend on what the damage output of the entire card pool looks like, and you have to be a little bit more aware that odds are the Pikachu deck is actually going to probably be pretty decent in terms of how quickly it can dish out some really early powerful damage, but at least weakness here is only plus 20 as opposed to X2, so it's not an automatic loss, but it is a little bit tough. Looking over to Psyduck is where we see some utility attacks. And I kind of like the idea of setting up a utility Pokemon in the front while you're loading up your back, especially for a strategy like Water, which is looking to be a little bit slower. For 1 colorless energy, your opponent can't use any supporter cards during their next turn, which is really cool when you consider that a lot of really impactful supporter cards exist, like Sabrina. If your opponent's playing a Golem strategy, we're going to see in a little bit that preventing their Brock from being able to accelerate their game plan could actually be a pretty big deal there. So we haven't seen insane supporters. Damage-wise, it's nothing amazing, and Psyduck does have 60 HP, which can make him vulnerable to counterattacks, but it is something that can throw off your opponent's game plan and potentially buy you another turn. Now we're jumping over to the EXs, and Pikachu is incredibly solid. I think he's very powerful. For 2 energy, he deals 30 damage for each of your benched electric Pokemon. The fact that Pikachu can deal 90 damage off of 2 lightning energy is absolutely massive. It does shoehorn you into a very specific strategy, but even just off the back of playing a bunch of Pikachus, you're in a really solid position to dish out some really quick, very impactful damage, especially when you consider that all the legendary birds are all weak to lightning types. So it just adds in that little bit more oomph, which means we're dealing that additional 20 damage. Instead of 90, it's 110. Not enough to OHKO any of them really, but it is enough that you can do some cleanup duty with anything else afterwards, and it should essentially guarantee you the KO. Of course, we've talked about Charizard. It's just something to keep in mind that it deals 200 damage right now. From the looks of it, that's going to be able to OHKO anything on the board. So if you're playing against a fire deck, just be aware that that is something that they can do if they're lining up a Charizard against you, especially since the Charizard has 180 and there's no other attacks at the moment that look to be able to deal with a Charizard the turn it comes out. And then we got Mewtwo, and Mewtwo is just relevant because 150 damage hits so far everything but what I presume are going to be most of the fully evolved EX Pokemon. So we haven't seen Venusaur or Blastoise yet, but I'm sure those are going to be the same scenario. But everything outside of that, so far 150 is the highest HP total, and 150 is exactly what you're going to need to be able to dish out some KOs. So odds are some of the best answers to Mewtwo, if you're just looking to one-on-one him, is going to be other Mewtwo's. So those are all the damaging attacks, and there's actually a few more attack-oriented things that we need to keep in mind, but now we're heading more into the energy acceleration component. For the uninitiated, energy acceleration is just the act of being able to play out more than one energy per turn, allowing you to be able to expand on your strategies and do your bigger attacks much quicker. Moltres EX is a fantastic example of that. Inferno Dance allows you to flip 3 coins for 1 fire energy, then take an amount of fire energy from your energy zone. How is that going to work? We're not entirely sure. Equal to the number of heads, and attach it to your benched fire Pokemon in any way that you would like. So Moltres is likely to be one of the most powerful starters in any fire deck, just being able to play it out, put the 1 energy on top of it, and then accelerate across your board. Very important, especially when we're looking to do things like load up a Charizard to be able to finish off our opponent. And while I don't know if the speed of the game is going to allow for it, does allow you to be able to recover energy depending on how your board is looking like, because a lot of fire attacks, like we saw on the Charizard, actually forces you to burn out energy, so it's just good to keep that replenished. Shifting over to Psychic, we actually have Gardevoir. So not only does fire have their acceleration, but this is likely going to be the acceleration that will feed into Mewtwo. Its Psy Shadow ability, once during your turn, you may take 1 psychic energy from your energy zone and attach it to the psychic Pokemon in the active spot. So maybe you have multiple Gardevoir, not entirely sure how that's going to play out, but this is going to be our means to be able to get there. And the power in Gardevoir going to be a little bit slower because it is a fully evolved Pokemon, but you do have a means to use it multiple times across multiple Gardevoir, and it doesn't cost you your attack for the turn, which is a pretty big deal, since naturally what we're seeing so far is you're going to want to load up your Mewtwo and then start dishing out damage to your opponent. This one's a little bit funny. Brock is a supporter that very specifically synergizes with Golem and Onix. Take 1 fighting energy from your energy zone and attach it to your Golem or Onix. It's very specific. At the very least, Onix is a base stage Pokemon, and then we've got Golem, which is a fully evolved Pokemon. So we don't know what those cards are going to look like. We don't know how important this is going to be, but one is to expect that if they have powerful attacks, you're probably going to want to utilize some number of Brock to be able to accelerate them into being able to use their moves. And then finally, as the last energy accelerator that we know thus far, we have Meltan, which for 1 metal energy, you get to take 1 metal energy from your energy zone and attach it to this Pokemon. So this does absolutely nothing until we see what Melmetal is going to do. So we just got to be on standby. But the fact that we have a Pokemon that self-accelerates is pretty huge. And I'm a big fan depending on how good his evolution is going to be. Finally, we take a look at the utility cards. What access do we have to be able to find cards in our deck or disrupt what our opponent is doing? And our first look is Pidgeot, and this is kind of where we have to kind of manage our expectations a little bit. If we have rare candy, which hopefully we do, these kinds of strategies become much easier because obviously you're not waiting 3 turns to be able to establish yourself a Pidgeot to then be able to get its ability off, but its ability is pretty powerful. Drive off once per turn during your turn. You may switch out your opponent's active Pokemon to the bench, which is very limiting when you realize that the bench is only 3 Pokemon big. So the rotation could very much force you into a situation where you're not as comfortable with. It's just tough for me to advocate for Pidgeot when we also have Sabrina that does the same thing, but it does cost you your supporter for the turn. But to anyone who's played the TCG at this point, Boss's Order is a pretty good card. This isn't exactly that, but it's pretty close. Now, of course, not everything's been revealed yet, so I can't make big sweeping expectations about what the meta is going to be or what Pokemon are more likely to sleep or anything like that. But at least now we kind of understand the constraints that we're working with. The typical 50 to 70, but on average 60 HP of stage 1 Pokemon Pokemon with the high-end stuff of things like Kangaskhan and Chansey. The EX Pokemon kind of chilling between 120 and 150. And then the damage that we're looking at being that typical base level Pokemon are dealing about 30 damage on the most high end, like Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan. And then when we're looking at EXs, we're looking at dishing out, at least in Pikachu's case, with a fully loaded up bench, a situation where we're dealing 90 damage per turn on 2 energy, which is pretty large. So then how we're going to be able to compete against that all depends on how the different accelerations in the game are going to work. Are we able to accelerate into our stage 3 Pokemon? And are we going to be able to accelerate our energy reliably, which we do have a few options that we've seen thus far. So with those constraints in mind, in terms of the way we should build our deck to be able to counteract what our opponents are going to do in their first couple of turns, I foresee 4 different strategies at least of varying degrees of competitive viability that could slot really well and at least see some early play. While we don't have all of the electric types yet, I have high hopes for the Pikachu deck. It gets out a lot of damage very quickly, and its restriction to be able to do so is probably not one that's too hard to meet for a deck that's based around it. We can round out the strategy with Electabuzz just to be able to get some good consistent damage on a 1-prizer, and then Zapdos on the back end to be able to do some cleanup duty. From there, I think it's kind of a gimme that we're going to have some kind of Mewtwo deck. From the looks of it, the most powerful heavy hitting EXs that we have available, that's a base stage EX. But with its heavy energy requirements, I think we're also going to see it paired with Gardevoir to be able to accelerate ourselves into that big damage. Talking about energy acceleration, this is where I think a Moltres based deck is going to be pretty solid. We can tie that in with Charizard to be able to OHKO any Pokemon our opponents put in front of us. And then I actually believe in bringing in Flareon. I will say that it's a little bit tougher to be able to make Flareon work because you need to go from Eevee to Flareon, but then the alternative is Arcanine, which is an EX Pokemon that effectively has the same life total as Flareon after it attacks because it deals damage to itself. And your bonus for that is just the fact that it deals an additional 10 damage. So I could be wrong, but I am in the camp that I feel like if your position is between Flareon and Arcanine, there could be an argument to go in with the Flareon instead, although you can't accelerate energy onto an Eevee. So there's something to keep in mind there. And then finally, and this is kind of the most suspect deck, is some kind of Articuno / Greninja bench spread damage build. Articuno is able to dish out damage across your opponent's bench, and then Greninja is able to snipe a bit more damage on a specific Pokemon as part of the ability, which means potentially you're able to do it multiple times a turn. Maybe not the easiest thing to do, and we're not entirely sure where all the support's going to go there, but with the lower HP totals of a lot of Pokemon in this format, from what we've seen so far, it does seem like a potential viable strategy. Taking a step back, there are a few observations and questions to be made. Things like, how is the energy zone going to work? I assume it's going to allow us to be able to use 1 energy per turn from whatever choice we want. I would assume that would kind of lean into the quick pace nature that they're going for with Pokemon Pocket. On top of that, how good is the acceleration in terms of evolution stuff? Are we just going to be sitting on our stage 1s and 2s, but we have a 20 card deck, so it shouldn't be too bad to be able to dig into it? How much card draw do we have available? That's going to be a big deal. RNG will probably play into the results of a lot of early games, at least with this first set. And then finally, it's actually looking like healing might be decent. In a game where you're really just kind of doing a lot of chip damage here and there, being able to play something like Potion to be able to get you out of range of your opponent being able to KO you the next turn might just be the extra turn you need to actually be able to close out the game. Just something to keep in mind out there while we're deck building. I don't have any fleshed out decks yet because obviously there's a few restrictions with how the games work that we don't know yet, but I'm looking to be at the front of the meta once we have all the details. So you guys are definitely want to get subscribed and keep up with me as we get more news. That's it. I'll catch you guys on the next one.